Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome all the true believers here at 7:15 in the morning that are coming in, and hopefully we'll have a great interactive discussion. My name's Eric Faulkner. I am a vice president in a company called Evidera that does health economics, outcomes research, and market access strategy. Been working in this area for 20 years. Been working in the area of regenerative medicine for about 15, working across about 50 or so assets in my career and seeing various make and model. And we're going to spend some time today talking about and debating amongst the panel issues around addressing uncertainty in regenerative medicine, trying to differentiate what's mission critical versus mission impossible. Many of the companies in this industry are small to mid-sized companies by and large without all of the resources of the larger pharma organizations. So how do you make those decisions? What should you focus on? What are stakeholders looking for in terms of the value proposition for your technology? And what I'd like you to indulge me in is a little tee-up of the issues, and then we'll invite the panel up and we'll spend hopefully about a little more than an hour actively debating. We don't just want to hear from the panelists, and you guys don't just want to hear from me, so we want you to also be engaged, please. Won't go over this in the interest of time. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves as we go through, but we do have representation from multiple geographies: Asia Pacific, Europe, United States, and manufacturer, payer, other perspectives today, so hopefully an enriched discussion. So one of the issues here as you enter the matrix of curative regenerative therapies, not going back. There's some core value challenges that are kind of germane to regenerative therapies. What is this stuff? This stuff is totally new. Stakeholders are not familiar with gene therapies, with cell therapies, with CRISPR, TALEN, zinc fingers. This is all foreign to many of the stakeholders who will be making decisions around your technologies. One of the key value propositions that differentiates the products of this industry from everything else that's come before, more or less, is the long-term value proposition. So you've got to think we're in it for the long haul, because if we can prove prolonged duration of therapeutic effect or a cure, that's really where the value proposition comes, transformational benefit. But there's a lot of uncertainty here. Again, this is new. Do we have evidence to prove long-term effect? How can you address this chicken and the egg issue? Is this curative? How do we prove it with conventional study approaches? We'll talk about that a bit today. Many therapies have a single administration model. I grew up as a gene therapy scientist at the bench, and the industry has come a long way over the past 25 years or so. But with single administration therapies, it creates both evidence issues, and as we heard at the payer panel yesterday, it creates some reimbursement issues. And the matrix just isn't built for these technologies. Our payment mechanisms did not anticipate therapies that cross over between drugs and devices, therapies that go beyond and have more complex episodes of care. For example, cardiac stem cell therapies is one model that's very complicated compared to something that's more drug-like. Many steps, and the systems just weren't built to anticipate these things. So we're going to spend our time today thinking about issues that are mission critical versus mission impossible, and this is the average thinking about regenerative medicine product launch. You're kind of hanging on as the plane's taking off here, because there are lots of uncertainties from the manufacturer's standpoint today as well. So I want to break it down a little bit into some dimensions of uncertainty that we can begin to wrap our head around. We've got novelty, we've got epidemiology, unmet need, so what problem are we trying to fix, the trial population. We have outcomes, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. Sometimes this industry has been criticized for insufficient quality of studies with health technology assessments that have already happened. Payers tend to like hard endpoints, mortality, did a patient have a heart attack or not, versus softer endpoints that are harder to characterize. Duration effect or curative therapy, we're still figuring out what's the best practice to prove this, and then impact on standard of care clinical practice under the outcomes issues. You also have how well do you work versus what's already on deck versus standard of care? And what's your economic impact? Because payer stakeholders are definitely thinking about the bottom line versus some other reimbursement issues that we won't really get into. Site of care, coverage, coding models, payment models, unique access considerations like copay, where this is administered and by whom, a specialist, a center of excellence. We won't spend as much time talking about this, but they're connected. One of the issues about novelty, what do we do about new? So this is from a survey conducted by the National Association of Managed Care Physicians and another broader global survey. Some payers think these therapies will be transformative, and many more think they'll have substantial impact, but very few think that these things will be curative. They're doubting Thomases. 80% of the global HTAs, and this is from an evaluation of about 50 at the time, 80% of these things criticize study design, comparator selection, lack of long-term data, and other things as reasons for rejection of the technology. Many payers raise concerns about safety and efficacy. You saw the same phenomenon in the early days of monoclonal antibodies. What do these things do? Are they safe? What happens when we put a cell in a patient? What happens if we put a gene in a patient? What happens if we put a gene-modified cell in a patient? We're still figuring that out. So there are a lot of things you have to think about around how you align your value proposition to cover some of these bases and make sure your evidence is sufficiently robust to prove and communicate value to meet the needs of payers, providers, and other stakeholders. We see some early examples. It won't back up, sorry. We see some early examples, and I won't go through this in detail, but we see some technologies that have faced significant commercial challenges. Part of this is due to novelty, part of it's due to other factors. Won't go into detail on all of them, but just to say that new also equates to speed bumps in terms of figuring it out, basically in terms of navigating the marketplace. When you think about unmet need, one of the things that payers typically think about is who will benefit? Who's going to benefit the most from this technology? And there are a lot of examples here. Personalized medicine, which is another area that I've worked in very deeply across my career. If you can say you give a KRAS test to a patient and they go on a specific drug, or you use eosinophil counts for asthma drugs, or you can use something that's broader and harder to wrap their head around, next generation testing that has multiple markers. If that next generation test doesn't point to specific decisions you make, it's a lot harder for payers to accept. Versus scenarios that you see in rare disease with acid alpha glucosidase testing to identify patients that would go on an orphan enzyme replacement therapy. So how you get to the right patient is really critical in this space, and we'll mention it again, but there is in all the conversations with payers about this area over the past 15 years, there's not going to be any faith-based market access. So whoever you have in your trials, that's who you'll be covered for, largely because of the uncertainty of what happens in the real world with this stuff, and also because of the cost. Perspectives. Won't go into this either. This is the Health Technology Assessment Global Analysis, but just looking at the different issues here, and there are plenty of them. Studies aren't of high quality or not enough of them, don't have data comparing to standard of care, don't have long-term data, inconclusive or inconsistent heterogeneous results, inappropriate endpoints that stakeholders don't understand or don't value, concerns about safety, insufficient evidence of efficacy. So lots of hurdles here that have been identified for about 50 global HTAs in a handful of markets that have very robust technology assessment mechanisms. So thinking about these dimensions is really critical as you think about your value proposition for your product. When you think about outcomes, and here's an example that's real world. So why was one evidence reason Sovaldi was successful and Glybera hit some stumbling blocks? Viral titer levels, there's a huge evidence base. We know what it means. It is defined in the evidence base. What does it mean when you have a certain viral titer level? So it was easier to make that curative claim. When Glybera failed on their primary endpoint, which was triglyceride levels, and had to rely on chylomicron levels, stakeholders don't know what a chylomicron level was, so it was harder to wrap your head around what that means. So tying this kind of surrogate endpoint to other things that payers do care about is really critical. And then there's also an issue around how good your evidence is versus your price point, and there's always a tipping point, which there seemed to be some connection here. The takeaway is the more clearly surrogates are linked to clinically relevant endpoints that payers care about, the higher your acceptance potential. And then thinking about uncertainty, another example is Jakafi, which is a cancer drug. Its primary endpoint was spleen volume reduction. And payers and regulators in this case thought, well, what does spleen volume reduction mean? We don't know. So in this case, they developed a novel patient-reported outcome to clarify the symptomatology, what was actually happening to patients. That was one key reason that this product is on the market with a gray area kind of primary endpoint that stakeholders didn't understand. And as you build your value proposition, it's like putting on your suit of armor. You might not be able to afford all the pieces of the suit of armor. There are a lot of asks from these different stakeholders, and you have to be able to figure out what's most important and what's least important. But strapping on and having a comprehensive story. Sometimes it's a let us count the ways story in this space because it's often not going to turn on a single endpoint. You have to make sense of it. The cardiac cell therapy is another example. You have endpoints like treadmill time, left ventricular ejection fraction. It's harder to understand whether those are clinically meaningful if you're a payer. So you have to tell a broader story. You have to use imaging technologies to make the link, for example, for some technologies like multiple sclerosis treatments. Outcomes, harder outcomes again. And this is a, go back please. This is a compare and contrast. So again, outcomes like LVEF and treadmill time, harder to understand. Outcomes in critical limb ischemia, amputation-free survival, it's really easy for a payer to understand that and to measure it in the real world. How do you set up and tell your story to be convincing to these stakeholders? The harder your endpoints are, the easier it is to tell the story. If it's something like reducing amputation, then the other endpoints may not be as consequential. But when you have cloudier ones, then you have to tell a more comprehensive story to be able to have the critical mass to make your value case. We're in it for the long haul. So we asked payers in the United States in this case, how long should these studies be? Most of them thought about 2 years. But the real issue here is if you're going to have a long-term duration of therapeutic effect or a cure, you've got to prove it. And we'll talk about one issue of how to get there. You start following every patient that gets the therapy, and one of the great examples of this is Strimvelis, where they did that. So coming to market, they had years worth of data that they could lean on, albeit maybe for a small number of patients, but they were able to tell that story, and many companies would not be able to tell that longer-term story, but in this industry, it's critical. And then one issue that this industry hasn't wrangled through yet that's germane to the payer panel discussions yesterday is what is a cure? How do you define it? Is it 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Is it the same for every product? Is it different across products? And does it matter if you have a cure? Most of our global assessment processes don't have anything to do with whether something's curative or not. We do have some things that you could make a case are curative: surgery, antibiotics, vaccines. The top two are lower cost compared to many surgeries. But we haven't had to define curative, but it may be important for this industry to think about. And it's important also to understand from the marketplace what technologies define as transformative. I think you should think of transformative perhaps more than curative. What's going to move the needle? What magnitude of effect is going to be really differentiating here? Another issue in terms of comparative effectiveness. Every payer thinks in terms of comparative effectiveness. They always have, they always will. If you don't think about it and make your case here, it can be versus standard of care. If you're looking at orphan and rare disease, in these oncology examples, we see technologies going to market with phase 2 data, single-arm studies. You see some of the CAR T therapies in that position. You see Xalkori, Opdivo, Keytruda. all having to make this value case with lesser data than what we had seen before in terms of going all the way through phase 3, although there are provisions to follow up. So there are tools. What tools can you use? Indirect treatment comparisons versus standard of care. Although this isn't really in practice in many markets are considering multi-criteria decision analysis to be able to understand how to stack up multiple orphan therapies and figure out relative value of them. Then thinking about issues around the economic dimension, can we identify the right patient for the best effect? What's the best trial design? Are there gaps in the evidence base that aren't covered in the pivotal? I have yet to see a pivotal clinical study where you can pack it all in. You have to think about all the other elements you have to wrap around to make your value story. How does this fit into the care continuum? And is it a replacement? Is it an add-on? Is it inpatient, outpatient? How do you get paid? What's the comparative benefit? How sure are we about modeling parameters? We've had NICE discuss with ARM several times their Sentinel study on here that really has started the dialogue and gone deeper than any other organization in the world to date on some of the modeling parameters that you get to and how you begin to link uncertainty to economics. And this is the NICE report. So just making the point that in a 296-page report, uncertainty is mentioned 250 times. There's a lot of uncertainty in this space. There's like uncertainty on practically every page of the report. And what's driving this uncertainty? Trial design issues, lack of long-term evidence, surrogate endpoints in some cases, transferability of evidence. And the greatest uncertainty is this long-term duration of therapeutic effect. If you have a curative intent model, how do you prove it? What's the standard of proof? What's the threshold? What evidence goes in there? Consider these early Vanguard examples carefully to understand how you need to think about setting up your story to cover these bases, to address this uncertainty. Some other areas, these therapies truly will be disruptive in ways that many other technologies have not. Trial designs may be different, modeling methods may need to be adapted, how the whole care process works. If we can actually cure a disease, will that be something that ultimately catapults up front as a first-line therapy, or will we look at areas where we have some pretty good treatments that aren't perfect and then add this on later? Thinking about those sequencing issues is critical. Reimbursement and policy channels and payment models, again, not ever built for these therapies, and we're really having to work through on a policy and practical basis around the globe as these things come to market. What does this mean? So just in summary, a couple of slides. So what should you guys think about? If you're not thinking about outcomes early from a payer perspective, you're missing the boat, because these technologies are going to undergo a higher order of scrutiny than your run-of-the-mill technology for all the reasons we've discussed. Think transformative. Think about how you change the game. Think about how you take the puck where you want it to go. Have a longer-term value proposition idea in mind. That's where the value is in regenerative medicine. Does it work better? Does it work longer? How can you prove it? Paint a full picture. Be comprehensive. Measure twice. Go out to the marketplace. Don't take anything for granted. Cut once, but be flexible, because this industry is moving very rapidly. And build an evidence optimization strategy that's realistically tied to pricing. That part's easy to say and harder to do in practice, but it's a critical step. And if you look just broad brushstrokes here, these are some of the key areas where regenerative medicine companies have historically had misses. Not building a patient follow-up strategy early enough. GSK did it with Strimvelis and did a great job of it. Not every company has done this. Burden of illness, understanding the patient journey. What happens to the patient? How do you diagnose it? Who is involved? Not only has an evidence layer, but it also has a how does this fit into the standard of care? How do we make a case for transformative? This is a first early study you're going to want to do. Having an evidence optimization plan not only helps streamline your spend, but it helps you differentiate and pressure test what evidence is got to have versus nice to know, and how you implement all the wraparound studies that fill in the gaps of your value proposition, and you figure some of this out with primary market research with stakeholders, and then plan for long-term follow-up. So those are some of the key things that I'm throwing up as a straw man for our panelists to pick apart, discuss, etc. And then in summary, before we turn it over and have the discussion with the panel. So just some things that you should do, some top fives. Plan for outcomes early. Think about it with every patient. Characterize the patient journey. Who's the population? No faith-based coverage. Who do you want to be in and out of your trial? Align this value story to decision-maker needs. We're in a multi-decision-maker model. Payers, providers, hospital administrators in the United States, IDNs, accountable care models. Ensure that think early about outcomes. Make sure your story is clear and meaningful. There are many technologies that don't make it through the wood chipper as well because their endpoints aren't clear or they haven't been comprehensive enough in their thinking. Characterize the economic impact, especially from the payer level. That's one of the top things on deck. Even in markets where they predominantly at the HTA level look at clinical only, they still think about economics. And ensure that your value story aligns with reimbursement. And that's a very tricky issue and something that we won't be able to fully explore today. But I want to now invite our panel to come up and do brief introductions of themselves, and then we'll walk through what I hope is that you, the audience members, will engage, because this is for you today. This is a space that's rapidly evolving, and want to walk through some key questions. So after they ride the escalator all the way up into their chairs, we'll get going. But Craig, I'll start with you, and we can go down the line and just do a brief introduction, and then we'll jump right in.
Sure. My name's Craig Cheatham. I'm a researcher, health outcomes researcher, pharmacoepi type research. I work at Kaiser Permanente in a soft money position, so most of the research I do is externally funded. And I do, like I said, a lot of pharmacoepi, comparative effectiveness, safety type studies for drugs that are on the market.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Donald Hahn. I'm the VP of Peer Insights and Access for Rare Disease at Pfizer. So what we focus on are the price and access opportunities and challenges for inline, pipeline, and business development opportunities.
Thanks, Don. Good morning, everybody. I'm Dawn Driscoll. For the past 10 years, I've run a global consulting firm helping clients to develop their strategies for commercializing cell and gene therapies. I've very, very recently transitioned over to running my own stem cell therapeutic company out of Perth, Australia. So I'll be sharing the pain of doing all of this with all of you shortly. Thanks.
And good morning. I'm Panos Kefalos, and I'm working for the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult in London, UK. I've been working in the space of pricing and reimbursement for 15 years now, out of which the last 3 years were spent at the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult, so I've concentrated exclusively on ATMPs, and before that, the previous 12 years were on small molecules and biologics, working for major consultancies in this space, such as IMS Health and United Biosource Corporation, which was subsequently rebranded as Evidera.
Thank you. So I'd like to start out with one top line question here. We talked about many issues around uncertainty, many dimensions. Of all the things that we've talked about, if a couple of you or either all of you would just respond from your perspective, if you had to pick one or two dimensions that you really think are pivotal for this industry to address, or an individual product in this space to address, what dimension of uncertainty is the most high order got to have?
I guess I'm holding the mic, so I'll start first. I guess there's a laundry list of uncertainties, but one thing that sort of keeps me up at night is the future environment, especially in the orphan rare disease space. We hear a lot of our stakeholders say that it's unsustainable, that the model needs to be revised, that the perception out there is that you make these programs faster, cheaper, with less risk, and that kind of carries over to how do we change that mindset as it relates to these transformational therapies of cell and regen medicines.
Craig?
Sure, and I think, well, from my perspective, it's really the comparative effectiveness and the safety end. I think that we're most concerned about when we're looking at these new types of therapies.
I would say probably your point about long-term follow-up is one of the greatest uncertainties that we'll have when we bring a product to a payer and ask for reimbursement. And I absolutely agree that the more that you can have long-term data, even if it's only on your initial cohort of patients, you position yourself much better for those payer discussions and much better for the pricing discussions.
Yeah, because it goes beyond just, hey, we think this is curative, high five, we're done. Yeah, you've got to back it up. Panos, do you have
I agree with all the points raised. What I would like to emphasize is that what is very important is to demonstrate incremental benefit short term at first instance. And considering that many of the products are being developed for niche therapeutic areas where it's challenging to recruit large enough patient numbers to have statistically significant findings and to incorporate comparator arms in the trials, the manufacturers need to make sure that even if they run a one-year trial, the incremental benefit is substantiated, and as you mentioned earlier, the regression methods that you can employ in order to undertake robust indirect comparisons, which will be better received by payers. And then on the basis of this, you can build your value story around long-term claims, and again, there are methodologies that help you substantiate this.
Okay.
Well, and the one thing I'd like to, you're talking about long-term data. I think the other thing is patient journey. What is the patient journey through this whole thing? And so understanding that, I think, is very important. And so that type of story needs to be brought.
And one element of that this therapy is a little different. Sometimes if you have an esoteric facility that's manufacturing the therapy that a patient has to physically go to, that's a little bit different than our conventional models. Sometimes we haven't seen the patients respond and think about issues like we're putting a cell in me, we're putting a gene in me. Can we turn it off if something goes wrong? We haven't seen some of those dynamics play out in the real world. It could be consequential if we do have something go wrong in a certain patient at one point or another. There are lots of elements around the process of addressing and having these therapies done that also is a wraparound of solutions around the product kind of issue that is also important, but maybe a step beyond more of the evidentiary uncertainty.
Eric, can I just say something on this topic? Because I hear very often the safety concerns cropping up.
Yeah.
But from a reimbursement perspective, if a regulator has already given the okay and you have received market authorization, it is secondary to the payer because the frameworks are not there to question what the regulators have already concluded on with respect to safety. So I would downplay this a little bit, and it's more about the regulators and less about the payers. That's my perspective.
Yeah, I think you bring up an interesting topic, Panos, because what we're seeing is a divergence in terms of the evidence requirements from a regulatory perspective versus the payer perspective, HD bodies, when it comes to, the severity of the disease and the unmet need. Where there's diseases of high unmet need, nothing out there, the willingness, I guess, and spirit of the regulators to say, is there sufficient efficacy and safety to in terms of risk-benefit profile to bring this, make this available for patients, or at least put it out there in the market. But then you get HD agencies will say, well, wait a minute here. We don't believe that the evidence package is sufficient. So even though the regulators say, hey, there's sufficient risk-benefit profile here, that's when you kind of hit a wall in terms of some of these HD agencies saying, wait a minute, I think we can't make a decision from our perspective based on the financing of this. So I think those are important variables that we need to consider.
Any sort of, well, first I want to just see any comments, thoughts from the audience, any sort of testimonials.
Hopefully this doesn't sound just sort of off the wall, but what about a post-approval commitment like the phase 4s, with the payer? And what about before that, since to build on Don's idea about the initial cohort, what about mid-stage mid-study updates, because a lot of companies are doing mid-study updates, but engaging the payer with mid-study updates throughout. And, anybody have any thoughts on either of those ideas?
Yeah. No, I think you raise a great point there. So, like, how do we bridge the divide between the expectations of regulators and payers? And so, of course, with conditional approvals, there's post-marketing commitments in terms of collecting the data. So, how can we sync up more closely with our HTA bodies and say we have to collect this data anyways? So how do we ensure that we're collecting the evidence that HTA agencies, in addition, will address their uncertainties at the same time? So that involves a lot of very early engagement and dialogue in order to make that happen. And there's a pathway with many of the regulator bodies and HTA bodies. I don't believe the same pathway is available in the U.S., unfortunately, because of the regulations and statutes where you can't come to the payers with potential claims of efficacy and the costs and economics of this because of FDAMA 114 and what have you. So some of those things need to be addressed in the U.S., but the spirit, I think, and the pathways, I think, is where it provides an opportunity to do this better.
Is it possible to co-own a design with the payer, just start from the concept of, here's where we're going to design it, here's what we're hoping.
Sure.
What do you want to see? What do you, before you start, data is the product. You fund, participate, publish IPO based on the data, so they can give you, the information up front.
I think ideally, that's exactly what we should be doing. I think it's highly variable by country, though. So obviously, many countries have vastly different reimbursement systems. Some countries have single-payer government systems. Other countries, like the U.S., have a complete mixed bag of different types of payers. So I think what you're suggesting is a very good ideal to aim for, but depending on where you are, you may or may not have that chance to be collaborative with a payer. I think the best approach is probably to try to engage the payers as early as you can, and that word try is quite tricky because with some payers, they have the approach that they actually don't want to hear from you until you have an approval. I think many more payers are receptive, especially if you're in regenerative medicine, because they recognize that these products may have massive budget impacts. But I think if you aim to have a collaborative discussion, I don't think you will actually have a co-plan, but if you can demonstrate your rationale for why you want to do something and why you've picked certain endpoints as being demonstrative of your product value, you're well on your way.
And there are multiple ways to do it. You can have interviews with these stakeholders up front as you're designing your protocol and your wraparound studies. You can hold advisory boards at certain points. There are markets that have early engagement, mechanisms, just like you see on the regulatory side. Canada is one. United States, CMS is one. Commercial payers don't often have as formal of a process as you see, but you see many markets. The UK has an early engagement process where you can, say here is what we are planning, and here's our rationale. One thing that I've seen payers miss across my whole career is some of the manufacturer knows the technology better than the payer will. The payer is sort of a mossy rock in a river of technologies flowing by them, and they have to keep up with all of these areas. But understanding the rationale for why you might design a trial a certain way is really critical to have that dialogue, because I've seen a lot of those misses in those discussions. One question I want to bring back to you, Craig, is the real-world evidence type issue. So a lot of payers say we'd love to have real-world evidence. There are some compliance issues that Don raised about how that's harder in some cases than others. But with these technologies, you either have to do it up front and start collecting data with outcomes in mind on every patient you ever touch, or you have to do it on the back end and then prove it out through your registry model, which compromises your pricing potential at that point because you only have a couple of years worth of data. How will payers think about the evidence from these post-market follow-ups? What suggestions would you have for a U.S. commercial payer environment?
Well, and to get to your question, I think maybe not necessarily product specific, but if you're talking about what's the natural history of some of these diseases, because again, it becomes an issue where the payers may not have a good understanding of what that natural history is, and so if you can engage these payers and people that have long-term longitudinal data on some of these patients, and you engage them at a point early where they get an understanding of what that is, and that can lead to, I think, subsequent studies, the wraparound things, the post-marketing type things that I think you're talking about.
And one thing that you often see more frequently is that companies don't start thinking about the outcomes early enough. They're thinking about the regulatory milestone predominantly. Their clinical teams are weighing in on the endpoints that are going to be in your trial, and you don't have that pressure testing with payers. Dawn and Panos, you guys both have worked with multiple companies in the space. Any sort of thoughts, recommendations about, other than plan early, beyond that you think would be important to articulate?
I think you have to do both. Start collecting data early, but also be prepared, and as part of your contingency planning, to discuss with payers post-launch evidence generation, and especially in context with managed entry agreements. So, in the UK we have a very good example for oncology products. We have the revised Cancer Drug Fund, which is a form of conditional reimbursement, in effect, for those oncology products that have been assessed by NICE. They're promising, but there's uncertainty around their cost effectiveness. And the manufacturers enter this agreement according to which over a period of maximum 2 years, they generate additional evidence while the product is funded and used in patients, and at the end of that 2-year period, there will be another assessment based on the additional evidence generated to conclude whether reimbursement can continue or not. Now, that's a short form of post-launch evidence generation, because for cell and gene therapies which make long-term claims, I don't think the 2-year period will be sufficient.
Yeah, I guess a couple of things. So one topic that was mentioned is around early engagement. So you can't do that early enough in terms of engaging HTA agencies around major markets and payers in the U.S. around what is the evidence and needs that they see commensurate with the value that we're proposing. And that should come back take that insights back into the companies and say, okay, let's draw up this evidence blueprint, from phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and what's the trade-offs if we don't collect this insights? What's the trade-offs there, and what does this mean to the valuation of the asset? Because it's not just the regulatory hurdles we have to think about, but it's the payer expectations and hurdles as well. And those will require trade-offs of the evidence that you can have at launch. So mapping that all out in a blueprint, which is what we do at Pfizer, provides transparency and transparent internal decision-making, recognizing if we're not going to do this type of design and study, what's the risks and benefits of that, which translates to the valuation ultimately in the end that you can expect.
Don.
Question right there. Yeah, so in the United States, you have certainly more than 20 main payers. Globally, we have entities that are single payers. If you're going to invest multi-million dollars in a pivotal study to appease the payers, where do you start? Can you assume that one payer represents all? Should you talk to 6 or 7 payers? How do you know that the payer you're talking to will set you up so that you're not criticized by other payers who by 7 things that they don't like if you talk to the wrong payer?
Yeah, so I'm sure others can have a comment here. If you, in the rare disease space, orphan drug space, you kind of throw up all the products that have been approved in the last 5 years. And you'll see a patch quilt of access in terms of adoption and reimbursement. I think even with those, I say 1/3 of products are not reimbursed in one market or another, even though they are orphan and rare diseases. So that's where, I guess, internally the companies need to make that decision and trade-off. Do we forego these type of market archetypes that will require sort of at cost-effective evidence, and if you don't hit that cost per quality, you're going to have a delay until you can provide that sufficient evidence. Whereas other markets that are more, I guess, not sure if clinically driven or unmet need kind of focused, in terms of addressing unmet needs, they may have a different sort of expectations and hurdles of evidence. So those sort of trade-offs need to be mapped out. Yeah.
Can I just add one comment to that? I think first of all, we should try very hard never to put ourselves in the position of having to do a clinical trial only for the purpose of appeasing a payer. I think that if we design well from the beginning, we should never have to do that. And the FDA actually has some brilliant draft guidance where they were recommending taking the approach that actually Pfizer and many of the other big pharmaceutical companies have been doing for years, which is if you begin with the end in mind, where the end means your product label, you can design your clinical trials based on exactly what you hope your product label someday will say, and pick those endpoints that you hope will translate, therefore, into meaningful clinical endpoints and claims that you can make. But to Eric's point earlier, I think that we should also build in a lot of measures along the way that build that suit of armor around your value proposition so that if you satisfy most of your payers, you also have some additional data for the odd payer who may suddenly ask for X, Y, or Z. You have that ready. The other bit of advice I would give is just talk to as many payers as you actually can as early on, and you'll start to hear a consistent theme. And if, because of the realities of budgets, when you're designing a clinical trial, you have to make decisions about which endpoints to include or not, you can go back to that research you've done with the payers and say, I've heard 7 or 8 times that we need to measure this or that, and then that's an endpoint you would definitely want to include.
Or you hear, this endpoint doesn't make sense, I don't understand it. And especially in some markets, more in the U.S. than in Europe, for example, some of the quality of life and patient-reported outcome metrics, if it's a composite, are harder to understand. You break it out into symptomatology. If you have MACE as a composite endpoint, payers want to understand less about whether the patient feels happy inside and more about whether the patient's going to have a heart attack or not. And then, that just understanding what they focus on and think about, does your collective story, begin to address the questions. We had a statement from the payer panel yesterday that one of the issues is that a lot of the evidence doesn't answer my questions as a payer. And how you bridge that gap, talking to them early is one way to understand what kinds of questions are they thinking, how do they think about this in the context of managing, if it's a U.S. payer, for example, a multi-billion-dollar plan. Getting that insight from them early on enough to plan is critical. Craig, did you have a comment on?
No.
Okay. Yes.
Just a question, maybe stepping back, pulling up something you said earlier. You mentioned, like the criticality of kind of planning for the long term.
Yeah.
And then kind of view and vision, which I agree with completely. On the other hand, the gene therapy and gene editing and other companies that are probably large in this room don't have any revenue. And they are, what they're not hearing from their investors is plan for the long term. They're hearing, you're burning cash left and right. How's this going to work? You got one shot at a thing here and there. And so you have this tension between everybody's desire to build companies for the long haul and this need to run a business day to day. So my question for the panel would be, we have to think about brutal prioritization of activities, and there's a lot of stuff that we could cover off on.
Yeah.
What are the 2 things, if you were advising a CEO of a gene therapy or gene editing company, you would advise them to do as it relates to this? Like Don, for example, I love yours, engage early. Like, I think that has a thread that you can pull through on many things. You're listening and engaging them, but I throw that as one. But what are the 2 things you guys would recommend if you're a company looking at going to phase 1 or phase 2 trials?
I guess the only other dimension I guess I would add is patient centricity. What does this mean to the patient, and are we sufficiently capturing the value that it brings, and how we collect the evidence in terms of what is meaningful to that patient? Because I think all stakeholders would coalesce and say, we all want what's best for the patient in the end, right? And so the more we can look at those evidence generation and patient centricity evidence, PROs was mentioned, how we look at end-to-end delivery in terms of the product and the place, and I guess the 4 Ps that go around that. If the patient in the center, and how we build that the values evidence to support that is where I would start.
And while we're passing the mic, one answer that I would have to the question about the long-term issue is you're going to have to run a study anyway. You're in for a pound. A few more pennies to think about the outcome issues early is just a minor incremental cost versus getting that wrong, because it's a lot easier to start planning for that on the front end than have to go to market with 18 months of data and try to say, oh, this is going to cure blah, 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 or we're going to have this wonderful long-term effect. But if you can't prove it, it's not going to be a faith-based thing where the pricing and the value proposition are going to be misaligned. And then on the back end, you're going to have to do a post-market study in this space anyway most of the time. Think about that the same way. If you're going to do a registry or a patient follow-up thing, tacking on a few of the key outcomes to measure at a couple of time cuts, you go to one market and you have a certain value proposition, and then a couple of years later, by the time you hit another market launch scenario, you have an even stronger value proposition. So think about the incremental investment to tell that long-term story as best you can. It's not going to be perfect, but it's better than not having it at all.
And I think the one or two things really depend on where you are with respect to clinical development. So you did mention phase 1, too. I would say before you even embark on phase 1, there are a couple of very critical things that you need to do. The first thing is to ensure that there is enough room for innovation in the indication and the therapeutic position that you're targeting. And that is an analysis that all companies that are developing ATMPs should undertake. You also need to understand the interrelationship between reimbursed price potential and effectiveness thresholds, because that kind of information will subsequently inform your clinical development program, the endpoints that you need to meet in order to be commercially viable, and it can also help you inform the manufacturing strategy, understand what are the manufacturing cost thresholds, again, to maintain commercially viable profit margins. So with that information in hand, then you embark on your clinical development and you monitor how you're performing against these thresholds, and these thresholds are becoming the basis for your go, no-go decision-making and for going back to the start if you need to improve the product in order to achieve your targets.
Well, and the one thing that I'd like to add, and we don't really have anybody from that space on this panel here, is that there's a lot of specialty societies out there. So, if you're in the eye disease space, maybe, contacting, the Foundation for Fighting Blindness or something like that, where they have a lot of institutional knowledge on these types of things and patients and what the outcomes are that they're interested in. So I think engaging them along, just adding to this type of development of where the outcomes are that you're looking for with in the long-term type thing. So I think these specialty societies offer a lot in that respect.
Can I just throw in that's an excellent point, and engaging with the societies early on, especially if you're going to be needing new codes for anything that you're doing. If you will need a new procedural code, you absolutely must engage with the professional societies to help you get those new codes. I want to answer your question about what two things, and you might like this because the first one is free and the second one's cheap, which is always good for investors. Yes, free and cheap. First of all, when you design your patient consent forms, make sure you consent the patients for long-term follow-up, where long-term may be for the rest of their lives if you're doing a gene therapy. It costs you nothing. It sets you up very well for long-term data collection, but it's easy to forget in the circus of everything getting a trial going. The second thing is when you're thinking about what your ultimate product label will be, look through and see what else are patients using, what other options do physicians have, and make sure that your primary endpoints really are something that's meaningful to the physicians and something that payers are actually paying for. And it's cheap because you can hop online, look at every product's actual labeled indication, but then also check and see what the payer's policies are. And one of my favorite examples of the dichotomy between these two things is if you look at what the actual indication was for Provenge, it was a relatively short sentence defining a fairly broad patient group. If you looked at what some of the major payers like Cigna's actual policy was on Provenge, it was a full page, and every single sentence chipped away at your patient population. So if you kind of do that comparison up front, that guides you into what you need, what data you need to collect in order to get something that is potentially approvable and reimbursable.
Yeah, and I would second that wholeheartedly as you're looking at how you define your endpoint strategy, look at the coverage policies, the HTAs, look at what has gone before that's the closest analog that you can get, because you can learn a lot from looking at those documents that are publicly available and especially if you're going into a market that deals with economics. The most comprehensive by a wide margin of those reports comes out of NICE. You can read all 300 pages of every analog you want and understand in detail what's driving the uncertainty, where is the sensitivity issues that look at it from the economic market perspective, but then from U.S. coverage policies, you can see what they are focusing on to substantiate their position in the evidence base, to understand whether they're going to have just the one line item or whether they're going to have 25 different issues that the patient has to hoop jump from to be able to access the technology based on their own assessment.
Well, and a lot of that one page is driven by the clinical trials. It's driven by the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and they'll take it and just, if you look at those things, a lot of times it's just, you excluded this, you excluded this, liver disease, renal disease, all those kinds of things. And that's where you get that one page a lot of times.
Yeah, I guess a couple things that when I look at opportunities, there's three kind of domains, so look at disease targets. Is it disease of, how severe is this disease in terms of unmet need that's truly sort of impacting the patient? What is this disease severity? And what is the unmet need of that? And then what's the treatment effect size that we are delivering? How much are we moving the needle in terms of addressing that unmet need? Because some diseases, there's a lot of treatments out there in terms of satisfying I guess the underlying etiology, but perhaps we can provide something that's more convenient, but it's transformational. But is it really moving the needle in terms of addressing that unmet need and disease severity? So I think those, if you put all your assets against that, you may see a red, yellow, green scorecard that you would then develop, right, in terms of addressing those domains in terms of where to target.
And another thing that's fairly cheap, to one of Don's earlier points, is the blueprint. You need a blueprint around your endpoint strategy. You need the red light, yellow light, green light, some of those things, and really think through that whole process. And then you go out to the marketplace and you test your thinking with payers and with providers and with societies up front to understand, is this going to stick or fall off the wall, and how do we need to adjust our thinking? And that's a relatively inexpensive way. And if you design your evidence strategy more comprehensive than your pivotal, it may involve how you use epi data from a database to characterize the patient population. It may be, do we need to do a new PRO because the existing ones are hard to understand by stakeholders or hard to map to symptomatology? And if you kind of have that blueprint up front, it also helps you be more efficient with limited resources, because you're then not running off spending money on something that nobody cares about. You're channeling it to where you get hopefully the most bang for the buck. Other question? Michael.
Yeah, I have a question about what role you think modeling might play in predicting long-term durability of these benefits. It seems that, obviously it'll take a long time for the study to develop, but there are, as pointed out, patients that are falling at the beginning. One could obviously or potentially create a model based on those limited number of patients and just refine it with time. And I think that's what needs to be done. There's obviously no way we're going to know for sure how You know, I think you could potentially do something like that in these therapies and get hopefully the government bodies to say, yes, we believe this model is scientifically accurate, and while we, you know, it has uncertainty, at least you've now predicted how long the therapy is potentially going to last.
Yeah, I mean, this framework is actually available. So if we think about the UK, where cost utility modeling is the basis for decision making, for chronic disease, these models run over a lifetime, and therefore they need to be backed up by long-term data. So the Decision Support Unit of NICE has published a very clear guideline on how to conduct these extrapolations and how to support long-term claims through short-term data. So it takes you through the different regression models that can be applied, how they can be validated, which parameters you need to use, statistical parameters, in order to choose the optimal model, and subsequently how to combine that with discussions with key opinion leaders around biological plausibility, and finally how to use validated surrogate endpoints to further strengthen your message. But the challenge here is that the shorter the duration of your actual data and the longer the extrapolation period, then the greater the uncertainty, which again is addressed through the model by undertaking probabilistic or one-way sensitivity analysis. So the methods are there, and the payers, especially in the UK and other markets such as Canada, the Nordic countries, Netherlands, Australia, that they use these models routinely, are very open to the application of those in the cell and gene therapy world.
And building upon that, if you did have an early model, and to Michael's point too, payers in the U.S. can be very skeptical of economic models, but if you're looking at using the model as a vehicle to understand what's driving the uncertainty, then that opens up the dialogue to understand how are we going to bridge that uncertainty gap, what's possible and what's necessary, versus waiting to figure that out at the very end after you've already collected all your data and maybe you missed a key sensitivity driver of uncertainty.
Well, and I like the one concept of updating the model. And maybe even building that in, as data accumulates, so a year down the line, 2 years down the line, you do an update of that model.
Yeah, that's a big problem. Models are created all the time, and they never validate. They start at day one, day zero when the drug comes out. You never see any validation years later, predicting accurately what happened.
Yeah.
It has to continually refine that. Again, what they've done with climate change, it was pretty crummy at the beginning, but they've refined it. We should be using that in medicine.
Supportive of everything I've heard, I'm curious. In some ways, we talk about the pivotal being the phase 2-3, and the cell and gene therapy space, especially for rare diseases, which is where a lot of them start.
Yeah.
You could argue that pivotal, under quotes, your phase 1-2
Is
your most pivotal
yeah.
study, because if you design that, you can thoughtful about patient selection. If you truly have a transformative signal, that can extend into a phase 2, 1, 2, 3. You could
Yeah.
quickly get to market. But if you haven't put all this thought, you don't get there. So I agree with your analogy about spending the extra few pennies with the consulting, the thinking, the whatnot. I thought you gave some brilliant ideas there, Don. I am curious, though, looking at the two U.S. payers in the room, to get there, to get those few, the little bit of insight that might help us inform that phase 1-2, as early as phase 1-2, the outcomes that we might be looking for, access to data, access to natural history. That's often tough, right? Not just in rare diseases, but in general. So I'm just looking at two gentlemen right here who work at institutions who have a lot of patients, right? And they have claims data associated with patients. So what's the right way to approach you for a small startup company really early on to partner with you to get access to the kind of data that might help us inform a really good phase 1-2? And how do we even get started, practically speaking, to get access to this? Because it's easy to say engage early. In practice, it's not.
Well, at least within our organization, there's a number of research shops. So, and the ability to engage, more than one is important. But if you've got people that or people that you can contact within the research shops, and And generally, that kind of information is actually available. I think they have outfacing websites that you can actually look at the researchers that are involved in Northern California or Southern California or the Northwest or Colorado. You can actually and see where their areas of research are. So, I mean, there's ways of engaging and meeting these people, and I think that's probably the best way, because I mean, if you just knock on the door and say, we want your data, not going to happen at least within our organization.
So approaching names of people listed as research scientists like yourself and Kaiser, and beginning the dialogue that way would work for Kaiser.
That's a better way of doing it. Or even talking to, there's a research chair or research department chair at each one of the shops.
Well, we're not Kaiser. We're not an integrated delivery system. We have lots of claims data, which is not very good. As everybody knows, part of the problem with claims data is it requires the physician or the hospital to actually put down accurate diagnoses and codes, which we know most of the time they do not do. It's true. And so that's not, I think it would not be very helpful to you. It's oftentimes not even helpful to us.
That's where I wanted to make that point, because I kind of knew the devil's in the details, right? And requiring that extra investment up front to actually even get to that point to realize, actually, I'm going to get crappy data, potentially, and I'm going to have to interpolate with publications, with some of my own funded natural history data, whatever it is, as early as phase 1, 2, to get the data I want, because it's early engagement will only give you uncover more issues that you need to overcome.
That's what we shouldn't do. So what should we do?
You mean you as a company? Yeah, I think you have to go to good data sources, which are primarily, integrated delivery networks where they have a consistent medical record. Where they're doing things in a consistent fashion, and the information you're getting is accurate. We get, you get a claim will come in and it'll say general malaise. We look at it. The guy had cholecystitis and his gallbladder. I mean, it doesn't even have that code on the claim. So claim data is notoriously bad. You have to really go to the primary source. Electronic medical records work, but only if they're sane in the entire system. And that's, Kaiser, Select Health, and there are a bunch of them in the country, and unfortunately, burden's going to have to fall with them. And hopefully Medicare will someday take all this data that they've been collecting and figure out how people can use it.
And in an area like rare disease, it's very difficult to get that patient level data, sometimes seemingly darn near impossible. So one strategy and solution that's the pennies on top of the investment is that it is unlikely you are going to find your rare disease information, including because it's indexed and including because there just aren't enough patients. You can leverage, as you're setting up your clinical trial plan and developing relationships with PIs at sites, you can use that as a platform to do your patient journey study. And so you can do surveys, you can do other methods so that you can begin to really get a sense of what's actually happening if it does not exist in a database, at least as well as you'll be able to in any other context. If you do that the right way, that's publishable. That's part of your evidentiary argumentation to support different elements. So a lot of times with orphan disease, you have to go to like high volume sites at the site level and be a little creative, because there's just no easy way to get there. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, thanks. So going back to the topic of engaging payers early for study designs, how would you proceed in a situation where it may not be feasible to implement some or all of the suggestions from payers in terms of endpoints or other study design considerations, especially in rare diseases, ultra-rare space?
Yeah, I guess that.
Go ahead, Don. Go ahead.
Well, I guess the way when we go to payers, we usually get 5 different answers for the same question that we ask in terms of what's the right comparator and endpoint and what have you. And that's where we have to be pragmatic. And like you said, but the important thing is to engage before your study's locked. The last thing you want to do is go out and engage stakeholders and payers for feedback when your design's already locked. You're enrolling your last patient. So that's where things get a little quick, dicey. But taking that insight and then what we do is just make some trade-offs. Like, what's the impact of this? And what often is that there's uncertainty on the evidence. Usually, there's two domains of uncertainty. It's the evidence and there's the economics. Depending, in terms of budget and affordability. So, and usually you can reconcile all of those points, whether it's entering into some type of managed access agreement, risk share agreement, what have you, depending on what uncertainty that you're facing, market by market. But the important thing is you get that insight is internally make try to quantify the trade-off. If we don't do this type of design, what's the impact on the value? Because oftentimes what we see is that we get the insights, we communicate the implications, but it doesn't change the valuation or the price potential that the company is seeking. So the important thing is it has to translate into decisions and financial trade-offs as a result. So baking that into the internal processes and being transparent about it. And then what was mentioned earlier, what's our long-term evidence generation plan? If we can't have this at the time of launch, how are we going to get there? And it doesn't end at the regulatory approval stage. It has to be part of the life cycle.
And I would like to add that when we talk about payers, it's an heterogeneous group. And it's very important to recognize that when you're going to a payer, asking them information about clinical endpoints outcomes, that in real life these people are advised by what we call in technical terms PPIs, which is physician payer influencer. So there are physicians, key opinion leaders behind them who are advising them on that, and you can't take them out of the equation and just speak to the payer and expect quality information. They can give you excellent information if they have worked previously in that therapy area, they understand it, they have products on their formulary, they understand how they assess those. But if you move into the ultra-orphan space, the very rare disease, it's much more challenging. I used to engage a lot in payer research in the past with small molecules and biologics in the less innovative space. And the responses we were getting from engaging with payers were of very good quality to inform market access strategy. In the ATMP world, it's much more challenging because they don't really have any analogs to use. So an advice is let's be a little bit careful how we engage with payers at this early stage of the ATMP life cycle, because the analogs are not there for them to leverage and provide you with robust information. As much as there is uncertainty about the product characteristics, there's also uncertainty in their minds about how to manage those products in general.
And I think it goes also back to a statement that Dawn made earlier, which is, and layering on to Panos' statement as well, think stakeholders, because it's not just one stakeholder, there are multiple. Who's making the decision and driving the bus? But also, if you talk to enough of them, think 80-20 rule. You're going to hear some common themes, and then you're going to hear some things that are on one end or the other of the bell curve, and those bell curve things may be important to one payer, but in the scheme of things, if you cover the 80, you're in pretty good shape most of the time. And think representative sample. A small company may not be able to, you don't need to talk to every payer that's out there, but you need to speak to enough of them to have a sense of the trend. Yes?
You talked a little bit about meaningful outcomes for physicians and for patients, and the need for us to start to come up with new kinds of outcome measures.
Yes.
What do you see a valuable role for patients and patients within that? So payer-driven versus patient and provider-driven.
You want to talk about it?
Sure. So depending on your disease area, there's probably a patient advocacy group that already exists. And I think it's maybe the first step to take is to talk with that group and find out what are the tangible, quantifiable aspects of what these patients go through with their disease or their condition that you should think about building in. It may not be something that translates directly into a trial endpoint, but it's certainly something you would want to address in any sort of patient questionnaire or patient relevant outcome type trial. But absolutely, I would start there.
And I think that one of the issues that is often missed is there can be too much of a focus on payers without the focus on the provider piece, because the devil is in the differentiation depending on what market you're talking about. And if you look at what's happening in the United States, we're beginning to have this inversion of the power balance to a certain extent. We're moving towards bundling. We're moving towards accountable care models. So after you get past the, hey, you're covered sort of thing, then you're in an environment where you may have a bundled payment, and you're making an argument to a hospital administrator that is going to look at, hey, if we have 5 hips and one's 40% more expensive than the other one, is that one going to fall off the conveyor belt? That might not happen at the payer level, because the payer may say, well, here's your bundle, happy trails, manage within it. But you're going to have to think differentiation the next level down too, increasingly in some of these situations. So Craig, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that in an integrated network model, and how you should think about that differentiation beyond just the payer piece that goes down into the network.
Well, I think you brought up the patients and how do you engage the patients and things, and I think the whole research community is moving much more in that direction. And I know organizations like PCORI, which actually mandate that in a lot of these situations, patients are involved not only in the design, but also in the outcomes, and also the interpretation, and sometimes even the dissemination. So, I think you make a very good point that engaging these patients is important for.
Yes, sir. And then go ahead. Yeah.
And yet, it would be very valuable to the payer if a certain treatment were able to reduce the cost of those treatments for complications. Let's say that
and we're moving.
Does the payer join with the sponsor in any examples that you know of
to
help in the design
Yeah.
when you're meeting with the FDA?
So the answer is yes, but it depends on what market. So 15 years ago, we saw a lot less of this. This would be like parallel review, and many companies would be afraid, quote unquote, to go into a parallel review process where the regulator and the payer are communicating around the table, because they would, at that point in time, think we're setting ourselves up to have a much more broad spectrum spend to answer all these questions. But the reality is, in my opinion, is the failure rate is sufficiently high that if you're not having these players talk. So parallel review processes have been building and coming online in Europe for a number of years now, and it's another tool to figure out how to get it right. It's not a clandestine thing where they're trying to figure out how to make folks' lives more complicated, but at least you then have the benefit of having that dialogue about some of the trade-offs that may have to be made, to Don's point, understanding what do you have to trade off because they're just design issues, period, versus what things you need to stretch a little bit to encapsulate.
I mean, in Europe, as from last year, you can have joint regulatory and HTA advice at European level. You don't even need to do it at individual country level. So it's an initiative between EMA and the HTA bodies across Europe, which is highly advisable.
Francesca.
Well, I can provide my perspective, just seeing what's in the media from what GSK Instrument has done. I think they've done a couple things, like you said, right. One is centralizing the delivery of it, and so in terms of the patients would go to this Italy, no matter where they are, and get the treatment. So the samples and materials are not being shipped out, to get and so in terms of process, I think that's efficiencies that they've accomplished there. And in terms of the financing of it, I think the issue is upfront versus annuity or type payments. Do you pay now or do you pay as you go? And if I understand correctly, it's pay now, like pay upfront. And so if you pay upfront, there's going to be a ceiling as to what how far you can assign value to, right? So how much can you capture value with an upfront payment for something that's delivering a lifetime cure with an upfront payment? And I believe that there's a ceiling to that. Whereas with an annuity type payments, you can fully capture the potential value of that delivery. So, whether or not they explored annuity versus upfront, I don't know, but that would have been an opportunity to unlock the true value potential if they were to look at an annuity type model. But in terms of evidence collection, I think they've set the standard. Was 15 years of data, and which might be difficult for others to replicate. Which then goes back to the robustness of the surrogate endpoint. How much of that, how strongly can you validate that surrogate endpoint to predict long-term outcomes that you're measuring, that you're ultimately looking at? The greater the connection of that surrogate endpoint that you can translate to the long-term outcomes, I think you can trade off in terms of the years of data.
And to that point, Sovaldi is an example because we have wheelbarrow loads full of data about what a viral titer level means in that patient population. So it was clearer what the value story was versus, the Glybera example, which we just don't have enough information to understand what sustaining a certain chylomicron level means. But to your question, Francesca, about precedent setting with going in with a certain payment model with provisions, et cetera. One thing that have certainly seen on the personalized medicine side, and Iressa was the first drug that this applied to, is whenever the manufacturer said, we will pay for the test in this country, then shortly thereafter this became an expectation across many European markets where they're like, great, Italy and Spain are like, this sounds good to us, we expect you to pay for the test. Markets like Canada, you had to do it in some cases, and you saw the manufacturer begin to withdraw those subsidies years later. At the UK level, just kept steady steaming. Canadian level, it dropped like a rock. And I think if you look at risk-sharing agreements and their evolution period, one of the things that we found even in markets that were very aggressive about putting these agreements into place, like Italy at one point for oncology, you saw that the administrative burden of doing clawback provisions, the administrative burden of doing an amortized payment model with clawback provisions, and some of these things that we're discussing in this industry, is the administrative burden going to be more challenging in practice than we think? But I think that it does warrant some thinking about the precedents that are being set, because once some of the decision makers get a certain appetite for something, if it's transparent and easy to administer, then there has been other technology precedent for that initial couple of things setting the stage for what comes after. Not to say that it always does, but it can.
But I think it's worth recognizing that that precedent is more about Italy rather than the rest of Europe.
Yeah.
So Strimvelis is shortlisted to be assessed by NICE, NICE HSD, and therefore we do not know whether the same payment structure will apply. Of course, the patient population is extremely small, 6-8 patients. If it was larger, paying the full $500,000 up front would cause huge budget impact. So they have this added benefit that supports a specific payment scheme where you pay up front, and if the technology fails, then there's a rebate from GSK back to the healthcare system. But as it stands today, that's for Italy. We don't know how that's going to roll out.
And we have about 10 more minutes before we wrap up. I'd like to throw another question out there and switch gears just slightly. This whole debate in this industry about curative therapies, single administration therapies, how do we get paid, amortized models, all this stuff has evolved within the past 18 to 24 months, whereas there's a broad regenerative medicine industry that might not have a curative therapy, that may have something else. I'd like to just ask the panel, do you see any risks in this debate for the broader industry around technologies that may not be curative, that may move the needle, but may not move the needle to a cure? Any thoughts about that issue? Is there a risk? I mean, if you look at a personalized medicine example, one issue is that when you have a companion diagnostic developed in the context of a phase 3 drug study, there's risk that the evidence expectations for that test bleed over into all the other standalone tests in terms of value proposition and what it takes, and that's kind of the issue I'm getting at here.
I mean, of course, curative claims present a much greater burden for the manufacturer to generate the evidence to support those value claims. It may be easier in certain therapy areas, such as hematological cancers, where if you demonstrate remission at 3 years, a sustainable remission within 3 years, then you are considered as cured based on key opinion leader perception. So in this particular case, the burden for evidence generation is not much greater than 3 years. Right. So you can go for a curative intent, curative claim, and yet not have that huge burden. But in other cases, it just makes it more difficult, right? Yeah. And wouldn't necessitate managed entry agreements with coverage with evidence development.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think the point is to make sure that you can actually back up what you're claiming and have that show out in the marketplace as well as it did in your clinical trials. What I see as risky with all that, with all of those models, I think it's very risky for the sponsors. It's risky for the companies when you have something that may genuinely have been extraordinarily expensive for you to deliver to a patient, and then to find out that you're not actually going to get paid for that. Or worse, to have gotten paid and then you have to go to accounting and say, could you write a check out, please, because we owe money back to this payer. It's a very risky way to think of running a business. Okay. And I'm not sure how we're going to handle it, and I'm not entirely sure that we have to assume that a lot of products will be treated that way. I mean, if we think about the model of surgery, in some cases, some of our therapies may be on par with some of the courses for episodes of care for transplants or that sort of thing. Failure rate in solid organ transplant is fairly high, and yet we don't expect that the hospitals will pay back the payers. And so I'm not sure, I don't think we should make that assumption that just because we have a fairly expensive regenerative medicine that we will automatically have to be in that sort of negotiation with all payers. It wreaks havoc on accounting.
And if you look at the Nature Biotechnology paper, when they asked, would we like to have a payment model from the payer standpoint, they're like, well, sure, that sounds good to us. From the manufacturer standpoint, no, that doesn't sound so hot. But from a real practical standpoint, most of the models aren't set up to pay back like a mortgage anyway, so you're probably going to be at the position where you're dealing with an upfront payment, and then you're thinking, do we even need to negotiate for anything else like you're talking about, or do we try to drive the argument away?
The only comment I would say is that many of these risk shares are not risk sharing, it's more risk assumption. You're bearing all the risk. And so the important thing is that these things be truly addressing some key critical uncertainty, and it has to be time bound. Once we address that uncertainty, then this should be pulled off the table, right? And an alternative sort of approach found. So that's those are the things that we're need to be considered before engaging in this.
Any questions from the audience? Yes.
It's kind of a statement and a question at the same time, but inherent in this discussion of the risk-sharing mechanisms is the assumption that net you'll get paid the same amount if you have a single price for all treatments, as opposed to being paid for the ones that do work and not being paid for the ones that don't work. do you believe that's the case, or do you believe that payers actually have a greater discount for uncertainty, that if you can take some of that uncertainty away, you may actually be able to achieve a higher average price for your product, because the word of the day is uncertainty. And my experience of observing NICE in particular is that the one thing they really, really worry about is paying for something that doesn't work. And if you could take that away or reduce that in some sort of way, they will pay you a little bit more for the ones that do work.
And Craig, do you want to comment on that just from a general U.S. payer perspective, not representing your organization?
Well, and yeah, this is an area that is not really my area of expertise. Yeah. But yeah, I think, you know, when you're talking about the risk-sharing type of model, it's, you know, there's risks on both sides, right? And so how do you balance that? And clearly it makes sense, and like I said, I'm not speaking for Kaiser or anything, that if you've got one that works better, you know, the reimbursement should be higher. And again, it's the risk of, you know, paying for things that don't work.
And my opinion would be there are two things at play with that. One is that in thousands of payer discussions, you hear the implicit thing like, we don't mind paying for value if it's actually there. We're not going to take your word for it. It's a show me state, so you've got to show us that it actually works. And then that's counterbalanced against the other issue, and you can see this happening in oncology as one example, where there's actual anger from some of the payers about the cost of therapies, just the cost. Hey, this therapy is really expensive. Hey, this therapy is expensive. How did the price point get that high? So there are a couple of issues. I mean, I think that every payer would generally say, you don't mind paying for value if it's there. You got to prove it. But then there's this other issue with the pricing that is also something to take into account as you think through your proposition.
And I mean, in the context of the NICE mock TA, the willingness to pay per se doesn't change if you reduce uncertainty. If we restrict the term willingness to pay in terms of the 30K value of the ISA, that is not going to change in your cost utility model, in your EVPI, in your cost consequence analysis. So what they have demonstrated is that as you are reducing the consequence of uncertainty by using different schemes, different managed entry agreements, as you reduce that consequence of uncertainty figure, then you can sustain a higher price. But it doesn't mean that the actual willingness to pay per quality adjusted life year increases as the uncertainty reduces. It's still the same. Does this address your question?
Partially. The mechanics of the calculation, you're absolutely right, but in the behaviour of, you know, if you think about the panel that we observed, the behaviour of the individuals, it was that they were worrying about paying for things that didn't work. And inherent in that observation was the idea that if you take that worry away, that you can achieve a higher overall price of your product.
Which is true. By taking that worry away, by reducing that consequence of uncertainty figure, which was their major concern, then the price that was cost-effective was significantly higher. Therefore, they were agreeing to giving a favorable recommendation to a higher price when you have achieved that reduction in consequence of uncertainty.
And it's a lot easier to find plenty of examples of where something doesn't work well and we still pay for it anyway, versus the opposite, where you find examples where something does work well. You know, often there's willingness to pay a premium for it on some level, but you often don't see the things that work not getting really well, not getting paid for. Look at Gleevec, look at Tysabri as two examples. If you ask payers in MS and oncology, those are two products that they just come back to as a historical example of where something did move the needle, and they didn't mind paying for it. So if it does work, they don't mind. Now, how a curative therapy fits into the whole mix, are you taking money out of the physician's pocket in some way? There are a whole lot of other dynamics that go into the cure issue versus just the value period. But I think we're coming. I'm getting the signal that we're coming to the end of our time. Thank you for coming here early in the morning, and please join me in thanking the panelists for their time.